Brothers in the Dharma, welcome to Padmaloka. I'm sitting in the shrine room again at Padmaloka on a cold Monday morning after a very, very sunny, warm few days. Winter's decided to return, reminding us of how things really are after wonderful sunshine. And this talk is especially going out to many of us for ordination, men who have requested to be ordained into the Triratna Buddhist Order. Well, I've been doing a series of talks on the Bodhicharyavatara, and I've also given a talk on Dada Rinpoche, and a talk early on during this period of the coronavirus. But we haven't really spoken directly to men who've asked for ordination. We're definitely missing you. I'm sitting in the Padmaloka Shrine Room with about 16 of us, something like that. Not everybody in the community could be here today, but we are noticing your absence here at Padmaloka. We're noticing that what Padmaloka is really for, which is a retreat centre, particularly for men who've asked for ordination, particularly for order members, particularly for men, mitras and friends, but mainly we do retreats for men who've asked for ordination. We're really noticing your absence. So we're missing you, and we wanted to communicate with you directly. We'll send this talk out to other people as well, but first of all we're going to be sending it or drawing your attention to it if you've asked for ordination, all of those of you on our various lists. So that's all of men who've asked for ordination in Europe, and I think even beyond Europe. I think we've got all sorts of names on our lists. All of you are in very different situations. I'm trying to sort of encompass with my mind as many of you as possible. Some of you are married and you're living with your wife and maybe your family. You're living with your partner. You might be having to do essential work, so you're not furloughed or having time off, so you're working. I know some of you are working in the National Health Service, the NHS, and similar institutions, and so on, doing valuable work. Some of you are living alone. Perhaps you're studying. You're still at college and university, or you're just living alone. Some of you I know are living in communities, in men's communities, sometimes mixed communities. Some of you I know who will be listening to this are involved full-time in Triratna Dharma work. So there's a whole range of you. You'll be affected in all sorts of different ways by what's happening in Europe, what's happening because of this virus, because of this lockdown. Different countries are doing it in different ways. You're all of you as well at different levels of experience in the ordination process. Some of you have even asked for ordination only just recently. Sangha told us this morning that I think there's about three or four people who've asked for ordination since this lockdown has happened. So you might have been to Padmaloka under other circumstances, but you haven't yet been on a Going for Refuge event. And some of you may have asked and you weren't able to get here on a Going for Refuge event. Some of you have been involved in the ordination training for quite a long time, more or less. Some of you, of course, have been invited to be ordained. You were invited to be ordained here on this month. Some of you were invited to be ordained at Guhyaloka, which would the 4-month ordination course would have been happening at this time. And it's quite a time really, I think, because particularly if you're very strongly involved in ordination training. Yes, everybody's affected in the whole country in all sorts of very perilous ways by this virus, and the measures our governments are taking to protect us and protect particularly the vulnerable. But some of you may feel that your whole sort of Dharma life, your whole spiritual life, your whole human development and unfoldment has been disrupted and affected because you can't go on your ordination course, or you can't go to Padmaloka. Some of you will be, perhaps feeling this quite keenly. Some of you may be a bit frustrated by that. I know some are quite sad that they can't come on retreat here, quite sad that they're not going to be ordained in the coming months. Sad, presumably, because you want to express that going for refuge, that commitment that you feel to the three jewels. You want to give that full expression. You really want that to be witnessed and seen and known by the community and the members of the community, the order members, who you have great respect for and appreciation of. You want to emerge as a Dharmachari, as an order member, and wear your kesa with pride and announce your name, because that would be the expression of what you're really doing, what you're really experiencing, what you really know, the way you really want to live, the way you are already living. Perhaps, maybe in this there might be things which aren't perhaps so noble as that. Maybe there can be a bit of a grasping after ordination, maybe even relating to it as a bit of a status, a bit of a thing. That can happen. It's understandable. And I'd just like to, just tell an experience of mine under very different circumstances. This is a long, long time ago, when I was 19 years old, in 1976. Bhante had told me that he would ordain me in the summer of 1976. In those days, of course, we didn't have Padmaloka. Padmaloka happened in 1976, but this was before then. We didn't have a really well articulated ordination training. There was Bhante, there was some great order members around leading study groups. There were retreats, but they weren't going for refuge retreats. They were just retreats, weekend retreats, summer retreats, Easter retreats, retreats in the winter time. But you definitely didn't have the full articulated training that we've had developed now. It was a much more haphazard affair. But Bhante had told me he'd ordained me sometime in the summer of 76, but then there was a sort of silence. And I kind of got the impression that, things weren't going, as it were, to my plan. Something had happened to me, and nobody was saying anything. I didn't get any feedback or anything like that. I just thought, maybe things are a bit off. And I felt frustrated, and I felt tight about that, and I felt sort of almost grabby about that. Why not? Why aren't they ordaining me? What's going on? And fortunately for me, which was a very unpleasant negative state, fortunately for me, I had the sense to let go of that just wasn't a helpful way of approaching things. I didn't talk to anybody about that. I just knew it wasn't a helpful way of approaching things. And I let go of that. And what I said to myself was, it's okay. You can still go for refuge. Now, in those days, we didn't talk about going for refuge so much. It was there, for sure. But we talked about ordination in terms of commitment. You were either committed, you were an order member with a kesa and a name, and a sadhana, and you went to chapter meetings, or you were not committed. You were trying to be committed, but you were just a mitra or a friend. But I had the sense to reflect whether you're ordained or not. Richard, that was my name in those days, talking to myself. You can still go for refuge. And that's the important thing. And I had that thought because Bhante, to my great good fortune, had given me permission to take up the going for refuge and prostration practice when I was a Mitra, which was very unusual in those days. And it was a prostration practice devoted to a refuge tree with Padmasambhava at the centre, the form of the practice that he received from his Nyingma Pa teacher, Khatchu Rinpoche. And I loved that practice. I'd do a lot of prostrations in those days, long sessions in every morning, sometimes long sessions in the evening, in my tiny little room in the community we lived in North London, number 5 Balmore Street, Maitri Vihara, as Bhante called it. So I could let go because I had this practice. I could just surrender. I could follow that practice, which began with the wonderful words. First of all, the going for refuge, which is the basis of everything, for all jhanas, great and small. First of all, the going for refuge, which is the basis for everything, for all jhanas, great or small. And I could let go and I could relax in full confidence that if I was going for refuge, that truth would be seen, and the order members would see it, Bhante would see it. I had a lot of confidence in Bhante and the order that would be seen, that would be known. And it was interesting how out of that, it changed from that negative frustration, turning ordination into a thing that I was going to get to add on to myself, into a deep longing to express myself, to give expression to that going for refuge, which was a very different thing from that tight frustration. Very, very different feeling, very different flavour. And I remember writing to Bhante about that deep longing as coming out of a sort of letting go. And it wasn't long after that I got the letter from him saying he would ordain me and Ratnaguna, as he became, the following weekend. So I found that an important experience, and it might be that might help you during this time. That reflection. Of course, my circumstances were very different. I was just a kid, a teenager in London. Nothing like the circumstances that we're in at the moment. Nothing like the circumstances that you're in if you have, great responsibilities. But the real essence of ordination training, and this is the point that I'd really like to make, is going for refuge. In some ways, the language of ordination process, ordination training, is misleading. I think it's misleading. It's important because, ordination, is about getting ordained. It is about undergoing the Dharmachari Sangvara. Sangvara, the word meaning ordination here, a binding to the refuges and the precepts. That's what Sangvara means. So it's very important. And there's this whole business in ordination of you definitely taking on and taking up a particular course of practice for the rest of your days. But it can be misunderstood if we're thinking, as it were, externally. If we're thinking of something simply outward, and I'm sure you're not doing that, but it's always good to check, why am I doing this? What's this about? And this is where the language of going for refuge is at the heart of things, because as Bhante has pointed out, ordination is not a thing. Well, he pointed this out in one of his travel letters when he went to New Zealand, and people were really importuning him to be ordained, really quite aggressively, trying to get ordained. And Bhante said it was as if people related to ordination. This is in the very early days in New Zealand. They related to ordination as a thing that Bhante carried in his briefcase, that he could sort of get out and give to you, rather than the witnessing, the acknowledging of something that is already there, that's something that's already emerging, and not just emerging, that is well established. And over time he started to talk about ordination being a witnessing of your effective going for refuge by, your private preceptor in the private ordination or the private aspect of ordination, and publicly witnessed by your public preceptor when you're received into the order. But the essence, the heart of everything is going for refuge. It's the basis for everything. It's the basis not just for all yanas, great and small. Going for refuge is the basis for ordination. It's the basis for all developments. In fact, as Bhante has seen, and it would be well worth your reading this book, The History of My Going for Refuge, Bhante's seeing levels of going for refuge, a deepening going for refuge as comprising the whole of the Dharma life. Very, very profound realization. So I think this period is actually very useful. I mean, we'd rather it wasn't happening. Of course, we'd rather it wasn't happening because of the suffering that it's causing, in all sorts of ways, the hardship that it's causing people, the uncertainty, and the uncertain future that we all face. We'd rather it wasn't happening like this, but there are many things to be gained from this, and not least, a good look at going for refuge, a good look at going for refuge. There has been a bit of a discussion about whether we should do online retreats or online things, streaming things and all that. Obviously we are doing things with these talks, but we're not very keen on that. We don't think it would really be the way to go for us, for all sorts of reasons. And in any case, there's a lot of material available now. I had an email from a man who'd asked for ordination the other day, and he's almost spoilt for choice in terms of what he can go to in his room, on his computer, the different things that are available. Wonderful, great, that's fantastic. Really glad that there is so much available. On the other hand, it's very important to use this time not to be online. Not to be online. It's very important as well as doing essential things, as it were, online, listening to essential Dharma and so on. It's important as well to be with yourself. It's very important to be with yourself and to go into yourself and to reflect very deeply on your life, reflect deeply on life, reflect deeply on the Dharma, reflect deeply on going for refuge, reflect deeply, well, yes, what does ordination training really mean? There is this wonderful word that you find a lot in Buddhist tradition, viveka. Viveka. Viveka means, it can mean isolation, it can mean solitude, it can mean taking yourself away from things, withdrawal, solitude, isolation. It's the word for going on retreat. You leave those things that usually distract you and those things that usually immerse you in the world, and you go away. There is even sort of higher vivekas, the withdrawal from the lower mind, that's dhyana, and so on. You can even see a progressive path of viveka. Well, in many ways, this is what is happening to us. So many reliances have been taken away. So many things that we usually rely on have been removed. Even a reliable future has been removed. So many things removed, from our usual experience, the things we take for granted, the props, if you like, even the refuges that we usually turn to, small r, the usual things that we turn to for security and support, they've been taken. So we're left very much with ourselves. Of course, we keep up with those supports that are really needed and really useful, but that experience of being with ourselves is extraordinarily valuable. There's almost aspects of being on a sort of retreat in all this. It reminds me, in many ways, talking like this, of the symbolism of the private ordination. In the private ordination, you're willing to go alone. That's the symbolism that Bhante brings out. Even if nobody else is going for refuge, you would still go for refuge. Even if nobody else in the entire world was going for refuge, you would still go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. You would still go out into the night and walk alone to find that place where there is somebody who is going to witness your individual commitment to the three jewels. You would still do it as an individual. Of course, the public ordination symbolism is that, no, there are others who also experience life in this way, who are also living this life of going for refuge, and you join happily with them in spiritual community. These are two sides of one thing, hugely important. So we can have this experience at this time of beginning to understand, perhaps, what Bhante meant when he talked about going for refuge being an existential act. Going for refuge, and by existential he didn't mean existential philosophy, he meant pertaining to our very existence, our very state of being in the world. Going for refuge comes out of that. It comes out of the facts of existence, the facts of life, the facts of our life. So we need to really be in that, stripping away the things that usually cover over the nature of existence, and being confronted, with these facts more starkly than ever. Going for refuge takes place in that context. I talked a bit about that in that talk on going for refuge in a time of fear, but it does bear repeating. He also speaks about going for refuge as a spiritual, a transcendental act. It's not just to do with, if you like, the facts of mundane existence. It's concerned, of course, with something which lies beyond all of that, not in some sort of heaven, which makes you blind to what's happening, but an entirely different, transcendent, beyond the usual framework of things. So we've got a chance, I think, to go more deeply into this, and this is essential for our ordination training. It's essential for our ordination training. It's essential for order members and their ordination and their involvement with helping people to get ordained. We have to be in touch with this level of going for refuge all the time, even whether or not there is a coronavirus or whatever latest emergency there is. We have to be at this level. There's a sutta in the Pali Canon, which Bhante quotes in the Survey of Buddhism when he's talking about Praticca Samutpada and the 12 nidanas, the 12 cyclic nidanas. And in this sutta, we find the Buddha before his enlightenment, when he was still the Bodhisattva. That's the Pali for Bodhisattva. Bodhisattva here means the Buddha before he was enlightened, really trying to discover the way to enlightenment, trying to discover enlightenment. We find this wonderful sutta, which begins with this very, very stirring paragraph. It's the Buddha talking, or the Buddha to be talking. Alas, into wretchedness has this world fallen. It is born, grows old, dies, passes away, and is reborn. But from this pain it knows no escape from old age and death. Oh, when indeed from this pain shall the escape be known, from this pain, from this old age and death? A very, very important, stirring sutta. So this word, we're just picking up on some of the Pali words. So wretchedness is a translation of the Pali kiccha, which means distressed, in difficulty, poor, miserable, painful, trouble. We're sort of feeling that at the moment. The world has fallen into trouble with the effect of this virus and so on. Actually, the world has always fallen into trouble. It's always in difficulty. It's in the difficulty of birth, aging, sickness, death, repeated rebirth. Rebirth in Buddhist tradition isn't some sort of sentimental, romantic way of making you feel better because you're going to, keep living. It's not that. It's regarded as incredibly painful. This cyclic, this endless, going round and round the same old patterns, life after life. Yes, and this word "fallen" I find very interesting. We've fallen into this. There's that Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, had this whole idea of experiencing our thrownness, that we've just been thrown into existence. We're just thrown into it, fallen into it. What do we do with it? That sort of idea. So into wretchedness has this world fallen. Have we fallen? And we can feel like that sometimes. It's perhaps not something we dwell on very much. We don't want to, look at things in terms of being born, aging, getting sick, dying, and going around the same old patterns. We don't particularly want to be confronted with that. We don't even want to sort of see it as something sort of imprisoning. But for the Bodhisattva, it is imprisoning. Not just for him, you notice this, the world. This is quite important. It's not just about him. It's the whole of life has this problem. What is life for if this is what's happening? And he says, this wonderful phrase, from this pain, it knows, the word is prajna, it knows no escape. It knows no escape. Now the word escape is very, very interesting. It's nisarana. Nisarana, which means, sarana means refuge. So no refuge and escape are the same thing. It knows no way out to find a refuge, if you like. It knows no way out. So there's a relationship between this language of escape and finding a refuge, finding real protection, finding that which will liberate you. There's a relationship between the two. Bhante explores this, by the way, beautifully in the lecture in the Tantric Path series, the symbolism of the cosmic refuge tree and the archetypal guru. It's a great lecture because he has a whole discussion about escape and refuge. And he refers to some similes in the Pali Canon for enlightenment that the Buddha gives. That enlightenment's like freedom from jail, freedom from debt, freedom from those things. It's really the letting down of the burden. So from this perspective, our life of continuous being born, of aging, of getting sick, of dying is a burden. It's imprisoning. Sometimes, of course, people accuse Buddhists and Buddhism of being escapist, because they Buddhists sit there meditating and so on, and concentrate on their Buddhist texts and gathering together as a Sangha. Well, you're an escapist. You're blinding yourself to the way things are. Well, it's true. You can do that with Buddhism. You can do that with any religion. There is such a thing as escapism, blinding yourself to the reality of your situation. But real Buddhism doesn't do that. It doesn't get into escapism, but it is concerned with escape. It is concerned with liberation from this state of affairs. It is concerned with moving towards an entirely different relationship to being born, to getting sick, to old age and death. It wants to escape from that drudgery and that repetitive, habitual way of going about things. It wants to have an entirely different way of being in relationship to all that. Not by going to some sort of heaven. In the Pali text, you hear a lot of the word of nibbana, nirvana, the unconditioned. You get that indication as though there's a sort of dhatu, a dimension that you go to. But you can't take that literally. It's a way of talking. It's a way of getting us to really think about our situation. But you've got to engage with the reality of life around you. And of course, a lot of life, which is described as being engaged with life, is actually escapism. It ignores the realities of what's really going on. It ignores the realities of aging, of sickness, of death. A lot of life does that. And in situations like this, these sort of crisis situations, these existential situations, we are confronted with what we usually do to avoid looking at our reality. It's always at times like this when we're confronted with, what am I really doing? What can I really rely upon? Who can I really rely upon? Where is the refuge in my life? You know, when the usual things don't work anymore, when they've been kicked away, what do we rely on? You know, and you know, if you're responding well to this situation, you know, and even though many things have been taken away and the future is uncertain, well, maybe that's a sign that you are placing your heart on true refuges. It's interesting. This in the verse you get in the passage I quoted, the Bodhisattva, the Buddha to be, starts with alas. Alas, this world has fallen upon wretchedness. How painful this is. Alas. It's quite interesting, this language of alas. I've been talking to people a bit who've been really feeling sorrow about this time. They feel sorrow. They feel not just sorrow for themselves, but they're sensitive to the sorrow out there, if you like, in the world around them. And, you know, even sort of slightly berating themselves for feeling that and not getting on with their Dharma practice. But I think it's completely understandable. And you know, it's appropriate to feel a sorrow at this time. Actually, it's appropriate to feel that perhaps all the time. It doesn't make, not in the sense of getting depressed and overwhelmed, but that melancholy, that sort of sense, well, yes, there is a tragedy to life. There is a tragedy to existence. You have this word domanassa in the Pali text, which can be translated as melancholy or as sorrow, and it's usually a negative. It's usually associated with disappointed craving and attachment, but it can be used positively. You get the domanassa of the man in the arupa dhyanas. That must be a very refined domanassa, a very refined melancholy, longing for arhatship. Even the pinnacle of conditioned existence, even the most refined of states, the most heavenly states, the arupa dhyanas, the formless states, are actually, you know, there is actually a sorrow in there because you're not fully liberated. There's the sort of sorrow perhaps that the Buddha himself experienced when he was with his teachers. But this feeling of sorrow at the state of things, we need to engage with that. We need to engage with that creatively. You often find in Tibetan literature, when particularly devotional literature, when you get these very intense songs of devotion, particularly the genre called the Song of Longing to the Guru from Afar, they often begin with Khema, alas, alas, this world is so empty. This world is so impermanent. This world is so full of suffering. And I'm so far away from the Guru's teaching. I'm so far away from the Dharma. I have so far to go. And there's this sorrow that fuels a deep longing for refuge, a deep longing to go for refuge. This is healthy. This is healthy. This is not unskillful because it's not grabbing. It's not grabbing. It's not that. It's the fuel that drives your Dharma life. Of course, in the Pali text, we also find the Buddha finding finding the supreme security, as he calls it, the supreme security from the bonds, the supreme security from the jail of conditioned existence, the supreme liberation. The Arya Pariyasana puts it beautifully. Still in search, bhikkhus, of what is wholesome, seeking the supreme state of sublime peace, I wandered by stages through the Magadhan country until eventually I arrived at Senanigama near Aruvula. There I saw an agreeable piece of ground, a delightful grove with a clear flowing river, with pleasant smooth banks, and nearby a village for alms resort. I considered, this is an agreeable piece of ground. This is a delightful grove with a clear flowing river, with pleasant smooth banks, and nearby a village for alms resort. This will serve for the striving of a clansman intent on striving. And I sat down there thinking, this will serve for striving. Then, bhikkhus, being myself subject to birth, aging, sickness, death, sorrow and defilement, having understood, being attentive, very important, being attentive to the danger in those things, seeking the unborn, supreme security from bondage, nibbana, I attained the unborn, the unaging, the unailing, the deathless, the sorrowless, the pure, the supreme security from bondage, nibbana. The knowledge and vision arose in me. My liberation is unshakable. This is my last birth. Now there is no longer any re-becoming. Very, very beautiful words. And, it's obviously meant as a meditation. Sometimes the sort of headbangers can, what does he mean by the unborn and the unaging and the deathless? No, that's not for that kind of reflection. This is a meditation. He's evoking the beyond. He's evoking the mystery of nirvana. That's what you have to meditate on here. You have to meditate on the supreme refuge, the supreme escape and liberation. And of course, after this in the Arya Pariyasana Sutta, the Buddha has doubts. He has doubts about whether he can communicate what this is and the way to it. He kind of looks around and sees, just how ignorant we all are, how lost we all are. And if he tried to communicate this dimension, people just wouldn't get it. And that would be painful. That miscommunication, that misunderstanding, that would be so painful for everybody involved. But thankfully, there's various descriptions of how it happened. He looked again, and he had that great vision of all beings as red and blue and white lotuses growing up in a great lake, moving upwards, and he knew that yes, some will see, some will know this, some will get this. And it's interesting the kind of language that's used when he leaves Aruvula, when he leaves Bodh Gaya, as we now call it. We hear this phrase ringing out, the deathless has been attained. Open the door of the deathless. Open the door of the deathless. And of course, one of the things that would happen as the Buddha communicated, one of the many things that would happen when the Buddha communicated to people, not everybody would get his communication, but many seemed to get his communication. That communication might happen with any kind of person. It might be a wanderer, another renunciate, it might be family people, it might be business people, farmers, young, old, men, women. There would be a communication. The communication might take the form of an incredible discourse, a formal discourse. It might be more spontaneous than that, just a kind of conversation, an encounter. It might involve a lot of words, it might involve very, very few words. But the way people responded is so interesting. You've heard this many times. The way they would respond, sometimes they would just see. They would just see what the Buddha was communicating. Their Dharma eye would open. The eye of truth would open. They'd see. They'd get it. They'd get exactly what the Buddha was getting at. Maybe not in its totality, not full enlightenment, but something. Some vision of the way things really are in that moment. And they'd say, and you find this again and again in the canon, and it's repeated, and it's very easy to overlook it. Bhante, thankfully, has pointed us to it. They'd say, excellent Bhagawan, excellent Lord. The Dhamma has been communicated in so many different ways. It's been shown so marvelously in so many different ways. It's as if that which has been overthrown has been set up right. It's as if the way is shown to someone who's been lost and just wandering about. The way is now clear. It's as if a light has been lit in the darkness, so that someone, those with eyes, can actually see. And then they say, Buddhang saranang gacchami, Dhammang saranang gacchami, Sanghang saranang gacchami. As long as breath lasts, I will go for refuge. You could even say with every breath, I go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. This was the way they gave full expression to their realization of the Buddha's teachings. Sometimes they say before they go for refuge, they have this interesting phrase, they become independent of the teacher in his communication. In other words, they've realized it independently. It's not going to be dependent on whether or not they're with the Buddha. But still, they go for refuge. This is really interesting. They still go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, as long as breath lasts. So it's very, very striking language that the typical expression of commitment to the Buddha's teaching, the typical expression of vision, of being touched deeply, profoundly by the Buddha's teaching, is to go for refuge to him, to his teaching and to his community. We need to really connect with that, something that Bhante has been so strong about in his teaching on going for refuge, really trying to connect us with that deep revolution in consciousness, because that's what going for refuge is. It's a deep revolution in consciousness. Interestingly enough, that very early series, The Meaning of Conversion in Buddhism, he talks about conversion generally, he talks about going for refuge, he talks about stream entry, he talks about the arising of the bodhicitta, he also talks about the turning about in the deepest seat of consciousness of the Yogacara. His vision of going for refuge is that. It comprises all of these different elements and this deep change, this deep transformation. So we have an opportunity to really reflect on that. In the Yogacara tradition, the paravritti, the turning about in the base, the ashraya, the deepest seat of consciousness, the revolution in the base, is the expelling of all the negative seeds from the ala. You could say it's the turning away from all the false securities that we usually go to. The turning away from all the false and unreliable refuges, and the turning towards that we can truly rely upon, reality itself. So we need to have all this in mind at this time. We need to be meditating on this, contemplating the nature of refuge and going for refuge in our life. And of course, we can go for refuge more deeply, more profoundly, by going for refuge more fully to the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. And the rest of the talk is devoted to some thoughts about going for refuge to the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. Many of this you'll be very familiar with already. So let's talk a little bit about going for refuge to the Buddha now, because we don't live in the time of the Buddha. The Buddha isn't present. You can imagine the devotion of those early disciples being in the Buddha's presence. With the Buddha present, the Dharma and the Sangha would be present in him. He'd be everything. Reality was there in him. This is why when we read a Pali text and we notice that the person becomes a stream entrant, we're wondering what we've missed. Oh, read the line again. Nothing's happened. It's because you're not with the Buddha. The Buddha's presence is everything, really. As Bhante said, the Buddha affected people more by what he was than by what he said. He gives this in the first lecture of the Bodhisattva Ideal series, that the Bodhisattva Ideal really comes out of the example, the living example of the Buddha himself. And of course, for those early disciples, the Buddha is the teacher. In the Triratna Vandana, which we chant every morning, and I'd recommend you chant the Triratna Vandana every morning at home, because you're meditating on, when you chant the Triratna Vandana, you're meditating on the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, the qualities. He's addressed as the Sattha, S-A-T-T-H-A, the Sattha, Sattha Deva Manusa, the teacher of gods and men. Only the Buddha is called the Sattha in Buddhist tradition. He is the teacher. So why it's really, really important that you understand that going for refuge means renouncing other approaches. In the manuals on going for refuge, they say when you go for refuge to the Buddha, you abandon refuge in Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, that's Shiva, the Hindu Trinity. You abandon all that. You give up all that. You abandon all other sort of approaches. You can't mix your Buddhism up with other things. Doesn't mean that you can't appreciate all sorts of traditions and so on. I mean, I certainly have a great appreciation of all sorts of traditions, but the refuge is the Buddha. He is the supreme example for you of enlightenment, of the goal of life, the goal of our endeavour. So it's very, very important to reflect on that, to meditate upon that. And of course, more positively, if you like, it's not just about renouncing other approaches. It's also about really valuing the life of the Buddha. The life of the Buddha should be a constant sort of source of contemplation for us. I was thinking, when I was thinking about this talk, of a painting which is in the Sheffield Buddhist Centre in the Red Shrine Room up there. It's a painting, an early painting by Padmaloka of the Buddha sitting at the centre at his enlightenment, and around the Buddha are different scenes from his life. This is a very, very common way of depicting the life of the Buddha. It's like you just get these little pictures around the Buddha, and you have these scenes from his life. They're there to contemplate. They're there to contemplate, regular contemplation. So this is why reading the Pali texts, where you have the most vivid expression of the historical Buddha, the Buddha as a man, interacting with people like ourselves, that material is so important. You see the Buddha engaging with all kinds of people, ignorant people, angry people, proud people, lost people, suffering people, people really searching for something, for some sort of realization. Scoundrels, murderers, thieves, playboys, any kind of people, courtesans, even kings, queens, you name it. He interacts, he finds a way of communicating with them vividly, perfectly. You can see that, and you have to meditate on that. You have to reflect on all of that. Yes, you can do the visualization, the Shakyamuni meditation, you can do the recollection of the Buddha, but sometimes it's good just to sit in your chair and just to bring to mind stories from the life of the Buddha and really be there. Really be in them. We have Wesak coming up, Vaishakha Purnima, which we call Buddha Day, the celebration of the Buddha's enlightenment. Well, as we move towards that, perhaps this is what we should be doing, bringing to mind the life of the Buddha. One of the reasons I'm so grateful to Bhante is that I feel that he's initiated me into the Buddha. What I mean by that, the way Bhante tells a story from the life of the Buddha, you feel as though you're there. I remember here at Padmaloka, in what's now the dining room, but it was our shrine room, being present when he gave that lecture, The Case of Dysentery, about the Buddha tending the sick monk. And it was extraordinary. It was as if he was an eyewitness to what went on. I mean, Bhante has this extraordinary empathic imagination. And whatever he reads, he feels it so intensely. And such a deep feeling for the Buddha. Such a deep feeling for the Buddha and how the Buddha would interact. And he's been my key, my entryway into how to, as it were, read the Pali Canon, how to imagine into it intelligently, and how to weigh what's going on. This is so very, very important, in our practice, in our going for refuge to the Buddha, bringing the Buddha vividly alive in our lives. On a regular basis, on a daily basis. You have this great practice that developed even in the time of the Buddha, the Buddhanusati. The Buddhanusati. It's usually translated the recollection of the Buddha, but sati just means memory. For the early disciples, it would be remembering the Buddha. Remembering the Buddha. Okay? Sometimes I think it's good if we can pretend that we are a disciple of the Buddha in his day. And that when we're bringing the Buddha to mind, imagine that we're sitting with him. Remembering sitting with him. Who knows, maybe we were there, in one of our lives. Maybe we were, if not one of the monks, maybe the doorkeeper outside, kind of looking in, hopefully, at this incredible atmosphere and feeling a bit left out. Maybe we were one of the beggars outside, something like that. But really try to bring the Buddha vividly into your consciousness. It's a very, very important practice. Sometimes you might even feel a deep longing to be with the Buddha. This is important. There's this is related to insight. Satyarajah drew my attention to a passage from Milarepa and The Art of Discipleship by Bhante. This is what Bhante says about insight and visualization. He says you visualize the Buddha or Bodhisattva. To begin, it's just a pretty picture, something beautiful and attractive. So it's a shamatha experience. But if you start reflecting that this is your spiritual ideal, that this is what you must wholly devote your life to, that compared to this, nothing else is of any value, all such reflections are of a vipassana nature. This is my spiritual ideal. This is what I must wholly devote my life to. Compared to this, nothing is of any value. That is a vipassana, an insight reflection. That's an extraordinary passage. And he says similar things when he discusses the role of the place of beauty in the spiritual life. The real insight element in visualization practice is the realization that the Buddha, or the Bodhisattvas, or the different Buddha forms, which all go back and come out of Shakyamuni the Buddha, is that the real Vipassana element is that this is the supremely beautiful. Nothing gets near this. Nothing gets near this beauty. And again, there might be that deep longing that arises in you. In the Sutra of Golden Light, there's some beautiful verses of a goddess named Bodhisattva Samuchaya, a goddess, which means Bodhisattva Samuchaya means the accumulation of all the Bodhisattva qualities, something like that. So that's turned into a goddess of all the Bodhisattva qualities. Well, her song goes, constantly, I longingly remember the Buddha. And constantly I am yearning to see him. Constantly, eternally, I make a vow to see the fully enlightened Buddha Son. Constantly kneeling on the ground, I burn with sorrow to see the Buddha. In a pitiful voice, I sob for him. I am deeply thirsty to see he who has gone to bliss, always burning with the fire of longing. Give me the cool water of seeing your beautiful form. This is an insight practice. In fact, as the verses go on, there's no time to go into them all now. It actually arrives at the realization of the sphere of the Tathagata, the endless sphere, the endless Gochara of the Buddha. And that this devotional practice to the Buddha, this sense of meditating on the Buddha with this intensity, bringing the Buddha fully into consciousness with this intense longing, reveals the nature of enlightenment itself, reveals the endless sphere, the pure endless sphere of the Buddha nature itself. Are really quite extraordinary passages. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid when you're meditating on the Buddha, when you're going for refuge to the Buddha. Don't be afraid to really let yourself go. You might even chant regularly, Buddhang Saranam Gacchami, like a mantra. In one Mahayana Sutra it says, the practice of recollection of the Buddha is going for refuge. Buddhang Saranam Gacchami. Chanting that again and again and again. Getting closer to the Buddha. And yes, informed by your study. Informed by your study of the Buddha's life. And of course, I should also mention that going for refuge and prostration practice itself, where the Buddha is at the center. The Buddha as the origin of all the refuges as they've come down and as they communicate to us, right down to our own teacher through Bhante. But there is the Buddha. So fuel that with that deep longing. And then of course the Buddha gives us the Dharma. So there is the Dharma Refuge. So let's look at the Dharma Refuge. First of all, the Dharma is the reality, the truth that the Buddha realized. The Buddha realized directly, wordlessly, without any intermediaries, the liberating truth of reality itself, beyond all words, beyond all language. But then it is that truth expressed in doctrine, formulated as principles, particularly Praticca Samutpada, and that finding further expression in the teachings and trainings and practices, like the threefold path, the three trainings of ethics, meditation and wisdom, for example. So it's all of these things and all the wealth and riches that have come out of all that, the eightfold path, and so on and so forth, all those different teachings. This is what we go for refuge to. The truth, the reality that the Buddha communicates, and how that's expressed through principles and through practices and through precepts. That's what we need to give ourselves to. I would also say it's not just that, it's also how that's been translated by Bhante, particularly by Bhante and his disciples, in the manner in which we can practice it now. It's very important, I think, that when we practice the teachings that Bhante has drawn our attention to, and of course there's a great richness and wealth of that, but he has identified a sort of core of things, if you like, that we relate that back to the reality as communicated by the Buddha, because that's where Bhante is coming from. You know, Bhante, one of the reasons I love Bhante is because he is a disciple of the Buddha. And he's tried faithfully to communicate the richness and wealth of Buddhist tradition in a way that we can actually practice it. I want to, and I do realise this talk's going on even longer than expected, even longer than usual, but you'll have to sort of bear with me. You're getting a bit of a feast today and you might get indigestion, but the poor Padmalokans, they're imprisoned in the shrine room. You can switch it off at home and go and have a cup of tea. But anyway, come back later. I'll hopefully won't take so long as I have done. I want to look at going for refuge to the Dharma in terms of the three wisdoms, the three kinds of prajna. I think this is a teaching that needs more attention. In the root verses of the six bardos, that great teaching of Padmasambhava, now when the bardo of life, this human life upon me is dawning, abandoning idleness, there being no idleness in a devotee's life, entering into the reality undistractedly, listening, reflecting and meditating. I won't do the rest of the verses, but the path is described as listening, reflecting and meditating. That's the path. Listening to the Dharma, hearing the Dharma, learning the Dharma, reflecting on the Dharma, meditating on the Dharma. That's how you go for refuge to the Dharma. So I want to go into this a little bit and see what we might make of it. So I think first of all there's this business of listening to the Dharma, hearing the Dharma. The word is Shrutamaya Prajna. The Dharma, the wisdom that is made, Maya, the wisdom that is made through hearing, through listening. Very often this is seen as the lowest form. Actually, you can gain enlightenment through this directly. Plenty of examples of this in the Pali Canon. Somebody hears the Buddha's teaching and immediately wakes up. There's no intermediary. Huineng hears one line from the Diamond Sutra. He's an illiterate woodcutter. He hears one line of the Dharma. He wakes up. He enters into reality. He just overhears the Diamond Sutra being recited, as far as I can remember. And then he becomes, enters on this path and becomes the sixth patriarch. Bhante, Sangha reads the Diamond Sutra, reads the Sutra of Huineng, and realizes that he's always been a Buddhist. He's always been a Buddhist. He's a Buddhist and he always has been one. His Dharma eye opens to some extent. Quite extraordinary. So hearing is powerful, is a powerful practice. Hearing is an interesting way of talking. Of course, Shrutamaya Prajna comes out of a culture which is oral, nothing written. A wise man was known as Bahushruta, one who's heard much. Ananda was Bahushruta, one who's heard much. He's heard much of the Buddha's teaching. That's why he's wise. And very often this can be sort of poo-pooed. Oh, it's just head knowledge. It's not. Certainly not in the case of Ananda. We're talking about heart knowledge. Because when you're hearing in this way, you're taking it in deeply. Because Shruta literature in Indian tradition is literature that has, it comes from a divine source. This is the way they speak in the Hindu tradition. It's got real authority for you because you have real faith in it. It's not made up. You don't regard the Buddha's Dharma as something sort of invented out of an ordinary mind. It's coming from an enlightened source. It's coming from reality itself. So you really pay attention. You really pay attention. This word attention, I think, is a crucial word here. Manasikara, wise attention. Yoniso manasikara, wise attention. So paying attention, hearing, listening to what the Buddha is saying and taking it in as it is. Not trying to mix it up with other things, not bringing too quickly your own ideas into it. Oh, this sounds a bit like this, that and the other. There's a great aphorism of Bhante's that goes something like, many people come to Buddhism because they feel it confirms the way they're thinking. It would be better if they came to Buddhism because of the Dharma contradicts the way they usually think. That would be much better. If you're in opposition to what's being said, maybe that's a better sign in some ways than you think that you've really got it and you just incorporate it into your mundane experience. So the wisdom that comes through hearing is you're taking it in as it is. And this is where learning by heart is such a wonderful practice. This lovely idiom in English, I wonder if you have it in other languages, you probably do. Learning by heart. It's not just in your mind, it's not just in your head, it's in your heart. It doesn't have to be very much. It can be one teaching, as little as half a line from the Dhammapada, said the Buddha to Kshudrapanthaka, I think his name was, who couldn't remember. Even one full line was too much to remember. So if you're someone who has trouble remembering things, don't worry. Doesn't matter. Just so long as you get something in your heart that is Dhamma. Even if it is just a verse or half a verse from the Dhammapada, even if it's just this being, that becomes on the arising of this. That arises, this not being, that does not become. On the ceasing of this, that ceases. That essential communication of the Dharma. Just have some things in your heart that you've remembered. Maybe things that you love. These are so important. And just repeat them. Just have them there in your consciousness. Just have them there and reflect upon them. Turn them over in your mind from time to time. So first of all, there's this wisdom that comes through hearing and learning. If you are like me, someone with a sort of a curious mind that seems to, gather lots of things, that's good, providing you have a core at the centre of things that you know. Sometimes people say to me, what is the sort of basis for your Dharma knowledge? Well, it's very, very straightforward. It's the first chapter of A Survey of Buddhism, Bhante's lecture series on the Eightfold Path, and Bhante's lecture series on the Bodhisattva ideal. They are the core. There's lots of other things. But if I think about what's sort of central, what's the sort of spine, if you like, of my Dharma body of knowledge, it's that. It's those things, which I've gone over again and again and again. That sort of forms the spine of things, because you do need, especially if you're one of these people who have a very quick mind, who can gather all sorts of things, you have to make sure that there's some core of Dhamma that you've really gathered in. If you're not one of those people, well, just have a very, very few things that you keep at the heart of your consciousness, that you're reflecting on, and don't distort it. Sometimes, when you're studying the Dharma, you do hit something. You say, I don't like that. I don't like the sound of that. Why did the Buddha say that? Why did Sangha say that? Well, a lot of the other things that have been said have been really good and they've been really helpful. If it's challenging you, maybe you've got to look at yourself. Maybe you've got to be receptive and see what's wrong with you, what's wrong with your understanding, rather than trying to make Buddhism just to fit your worldly life. The Dharma is a challenge and should be a challenge. It should provoke. It should demand something from us. So very, very important. Listen. You get this in the Perfection of Wisdom. Listen to the perfect wisdom of the gentle Buddhas. Clear away all your defilements. Remove all your taints. Take the Dharma in. It's very interesting in that tradition, the Perfection of Wisdom tradition, they talk about the perfection of wisdom being a kshanti, a patience. You've got to be patient, you've got to forbear, because the Dharma is so difficult and challenging sometimes. So don't just reject if what's going in and what it's doing to you is difficult. Be patient. Be patient. Stay with it. The profound is opening to you. But there isn't just the wisdom that comes through hearing, which of course is related very much to your faith. There's the wisdom called Chintamaya Prajna, the wisdom that's made, the knowing of the Dhamma that's made through Chinta, through directed thought. This isn't sort of, asking, well, do I think that's true? Do I think that's right? No, it's not that. It's more that your whole being, D.H. Lawrence's thought is a man in his wholeness, wholly attending. It's your whole being attentive to that teaching. You keep going over it and over it. You start noticing what it's doing to you. Out of your hearing, out of your listening, you allow that Dharma, if you like, that flow of the Dharma, that to create a kind of groove, a channel in your being. It's going in and going in and going in. Yes, it might be that out of that you have all sorts of reflections. Maybe you make all sorts of connections with other teachings. And of course, while this chinta is going on, you're changing. The wisdom that comes through hearing will change you, but the chintamaya prajna will change you. It's not just a knowing, it's your being is changing. Because you'll notice, well, this teaching, this Dhamma that's moving in me demands change, demands that I live differently. I'm sure you can think of examples of that. And then we move on to, it's obvious, where what arises next, the bhavanamaya prajna, the wisdom that is made into a living experience. Bhavanamaya prajna is usually explained as the wisdom that comes through meditation. But Herbert Gunther, that great scholar of Austrian origin, he had some very interesting translations of traditional Buddhist terminology, and he says it's the wisdom that is made into a living experience, whether you're meditating or not. In other words, you are now, to some extent, the Dhamma itself. There's no separation. The Dharma Refuge is being realized, and it might well happen not while you're sitting in meditation comfortably on your cushion. It might happen in the most demanding of situations. Milarepa's pot breaking, his last possession, smashing. He can't hold it together. He worships his pot as his guru because it's revealed his attachment. Well, that sort of realization, this object becoming the guru, becoming the teacher, doesn't happen out of nowhere. It happens because of constant meditation on the impermanence and insubstantial of everything. It happens because he has a guru, because of his gratitude and love for Marpa, because of that blessing. It happens because of his profound receptivity. He turns that knowing into being in that moment. Lots and lots of stories like this. A cup breaks and suddenly there's realization. And, we break a cup and we just feel foolish or stupid. We spill something and we just feel annoyed. We don't see the insubstantiality of things because we're not absorbed enough in the Dhamma as refuge. We're not moving more deeply into the Dhamma through the three kinds of wisdom. It's interesting as well, what you might notice as you practice is that certain Dharma teachings will start talking to you. I find this happens on a fairly regular basis these days. And one of the things that's been happening during this time, it's come up before, but it's really emerged during this time. Just about every meditation I'm doing, I keep reflecting upon Anutpatika Dharma Kshanti. Anutpatika Dharma Kshanti, which means the patient acceptance that all dharmas are unproduced. The patient acceptance that all dharmas are unoriginated, all dharmas are unborn, all things are without birth. And this is, apparently a very high realization of an irreversible bodhisattva. And you might be asking yourself, why is Padmavajra doing that? Who does he think he is? I don't know why. But for some reason, this has become my koan during this time. And I think it's to do with so many dharmas, so many things, so many phenomena being taken away, including going for refuge retreats. Including all of you who come here to Padmaloka, you've gone. You're not arising. Those dharmas that are you are not arising. You living beings, which are a flow of dharma, you wonderful living beings, you're not here, so you're not arising. But everything is not arising. So I've been trying to understand why this realization is so important. They say, the simile they use for this is everything is like a magician's illusion. Everything appears, but it's insubstantial. It hasn't arisen. It's magic. It's a magic show. It hasn't arisen. It's unborn. Of course, this is another way of talking about the realization of voidness, but I'm trying to understand, why are they using this language? And why do they call this a patience, a forbearance? It's not nihilism, because, as the great Atisha says, when you realize that everything is unborn, that all dharmas are unborn, your body, speech and mind react with pleasure, react with bliss. And out of that comes compassion and love for all the beings that don't realize this, who you're in connection with. Amazing. So I'm trying to understand this. I'm trying to penetrate this. It's probably foolish of me to even think of doing this, because this is the realization of an irreversible bodhisattva. So, and I'm a beginner. I really am a beginner. I think it might be a bit related to Bhante's poem. That poem, "Life is King. Hour after hour, day after day, we try to grasp the ungraspable, pinpoint the unpredictable. Flowers wither when touched, ice suddenly cracks beneath our feet. Vainly we try to track bird flight through the sky, trace dumb fish through deep water, try to anticipate the earned smile, the soft reward, even try to grasp our own lives. But life slips through our fingers like snow. Life cannot belong to us. We belong to life. Life is king." Perhaps I'll report back in 10 years if I'm still alive and tell you how I've got on with this meditation on the non-arising of all dharmas. But perhaps it also shows, my little story there, that engaging with the Dharma Refuge, trying to understand these deep truths, never ends. Bhante never ended his reflections, never ended his meditations on the nature of the Dharma. The Dharma Refuge is unending and inconceivable. We never master it. In the end, you always have to go, in the same way as you go down on your knees to the Buddha, you also have to go down on your knees to the Dharma and go for refuge to it. So then there's the Sangha Refuge. Well, first of all, the Sangha Refuge, and this is not always appreciated, is the Arya Sangha. It's the Sangha of those who've entered the transcendental path. It's the stream entrants and the once returners and the non-returners and the arahants. It's the glorious company of bodhisattvas in the Mahayana tradition. It's all those, who've really, truly entered into the Buddha's Dharma decisively, irreversibly, and who are on their way to nirvana. It's interesting that one of the words for a stream entrant is sekko, which means disciple, someone in training. Your training only really starts, it seems, from a certain point of view, when you enter the stream, when the Dharma is really vividly before you. So, if we think that, getting ordained is arrival, forget it. That is really only the beginning of, before even the beginning, and so on. So it's well worth thinking in those terms. We're always beginners. We're always beginners. From a certain point of view, ordination is no big deal. From a certain point of view, ordination is no big deal. It's wonderful we have an order. It's wonderful we have a Sangha like that. It's wonderful that effective going for refuge is witnessed. I really believe in that. I wouldn't live this life if I didn't do all this. But it's what you do afterwards that's really crucial. In a way, it's sort of fairly easy to get ordained. I know some of you have struggled with it over the years, but it's staying with it. Not just staying with it, but deepening it and developing that ordination. Going on and on and on and never turning back, never giving up. That's the real practice. Many start the spiritual life, the Dharma life. Many people give it up. So, also reflect on that at this time. One of the reasons, because we can also talk about Sangha in terms of the order, in terms of our Sangha of Mitras and friends, the Mahasangha, as Bhante, as tradition calls it, the Sangha of all Buddhists, and particularly our community as a Sangha. One of the reasons why I'm a disciple of Bhante is not because I believe that he's enlightened or something like that. I have no way of knowing Bhante's realization. I have no idea. And I don't even know if he's a stream entrant or an irreversible bodhisattva or anything like that. I have not a clue, and I don't care. I find that way of thinking absurd. What I do know of Bhante is that he's a disciple. He's a disciple of the Buddha, because the Sangha is made up of disciples of the Buddha, and he's a greater disciple of the Buddha than I am, a greater devotee of the Buddha than I am. I know that he's a disciple of the Dhamma, a greater disciple of the Dhamma than I am. He is a greater disciple of the Sangha than I am. That's why he's my teacher. That's why I'm in his order. I'm a disciple of Bhante because of his reverence, because of his going for refuge. I remember one occasion sitting with Bhante in a group of people, and it was when Buddha nature was the in thing. Years ago, a lot of people were into Buddha nature. And the hard form, you're enlightened already, isn't that wonderful? You just sit down and instead of making any effort, you just realize your Buddha nature. And Bhante was asked about this, what he thought about Tathagata-garbha, Sugata-garbha. And he said, oh yes, well, in terms of potentiality, I really agree with that. We all have the potential to become Buddhas, yes. Yes, of course. But he said, the idea that somehow or other we are fully enlightened with all the powers and qualities of a Buddha, he said, no, I couldn't believe in that. I don't believe that. And you really had the sense, I really had the sense of someone who really appreciated, valued, revered, in a sense, understood the greatness of the Buddha. He wasn't going to arrogate the Buddha to himself. He was a disciple, a devotee of the Buddha. So this is very, very important that when we go for refuge to the Sangha, we're going for refuge to those who are the great disciples of the Buddha. And yes, of course, there are our immediate spiritual friends, our Kalyana Mitras, our preceptors to be, and the more experienced people that we're around. They're very, very important to us. But they're important to us to the extent that they really manifest the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. They manifest those qualities. That's the way we need to think of one another. We're very much, in that sense, a spiritual community in progress, a spiritual community in evolution. The order is definitely not perfect. The wider Sangha is not perfect, but we are a Sangha in the making, and at times we even touch into the very profound levels of Sangha and spiritual community. One of the qualities you're looking for, if you like, one of the ways you can recognize, if you like, somebody who, the Sangha more of a refuge, is who can you really rely on? Who can you really rely on? Day after day, year after year, consistency and reliability. Again, that's one of the things about Bhante, that that in some ways he has been a refuge for me, because he's been so reliable, so faithful, through thick and thin, through ups and downs. And I'm still relying on him, in the best sense, relying on him for my practice, because his teachings are still alive for me. After his death, so many teachings emerged, that he'd taught me, that I'd listened to, that I'd heard directly. So many things. So the reliability goes on, even when he is not physically present. So reliability is very important. I remember being on a seminar with Bhante when it was a seminar on the Sigalavada Sutta, and we were talking on the section on friendship. And one of the qualities that the Buddha says of a true friend is that they will be a refuge for you. They will be a refuge for you. Really strong language. And in the discussion, I said, "But I think it was me that said, so that means then, to be a true friend, you have to have something of the unconditioned. You're totally reliable. You're never going to let the person down. Well, that means there needs to be something transcendent." And Bhante said, yes, that's the case. So he said, from that point of view, you could see that stream entry is a means to friendship. In other words, if you want to be a true friend, if you want to be a true Kalyana Mitra, a true member of the Sangha, a full member of the Sangha, well, yes, you're going to have to be a refuge to one another. You're going to have something of the transcendent in you. You're going to have to go for refuge in the real sense, so that you're irreversible in the Dharma. So what this brings up, this sort of way of talking, this sort of language, to make a spiritual community, we have to go for refuge more and more deeply, more and more, as it were, independently, not individualistically, taking full responsibility for our part in things, playing our part in the activity of spiritual community. You can't be passive in a spiritual community. Passive members of a spiritual community are a contradiction in terms. You have to be fully practicing and fully keeping each other in mind. Yes, one of the teachings of the Buddha about the health of the Sangha is meeting regularly in large numbers. We can't do that at the moment. We have large numbers here. There's 18 of us. That's quite a large gathering, actually, at this time, I gather. And we're getting on very, very well. I think we are being, to some extent, if not a refuge to one another, certainly sources of reliability to one another. Yes, there's online stuff, very good. But we've also got to meet more on the mental plane. There's a wonderful lecture by Bhante called Fidelity, or Fidelity as he pronounces it. I recommend that you listen to that lecture. He's talking about the continuity of friendship, the faithfulness to ideals and to one another when they're not present, when you're apart in time and space, and how important that is. How important it is to live. It doesn't mean mental in the sense of just in the sense of just ideas, but the heart plane. We need to be meeting more deeply on this level. Bhante really felt this very strongly, and that's why he taught us the Order Metabhavna, with order members doing loving kindness meditation to one another every month. It came out of his own experience of the order present when he was on solitary retreat. We have to keep alive our responsiveness to one another, even though we're not physically present to one another. In some ways, and I haven't got a down on online activity at all, but in some ways, that sort of activity might distract us from that deeper meeting, which the old traditions knew. Milarepa was never apart from Marpa. No internet in, 11th century Tibet. But the vivid sense of the presence of the teacher, the vivid sense of the presence of his disciples and his spiritual friends, we can do that. We can do that every day, so that we experience the Sangha on that level. Perhaps even, we can practice that going for refuge to the Sangha that Bhante describes in the meaning of conversion in Buddhism, of leaving mere contact and entering into a vital mutual responsiveness, a common exploration of the spiritual world, a vital mutual responsiveness, even though we're not with each other, a vital mutual responsiveness. When we meditate, bring to mind your friends in the Sangha. When you do puja, bring to mind your friends in the Sangha. When you're doing the going for refuge and prostration practice, bring to mind your friends in the Sangha. Even though they're far away, even though you don't know when you're next going to see them, even though you might have some longing to see them, well, that's good. It means that you really do care about them deeply. Bring it all vividly to mind. Perhaps, just perhaps, if we can do that during this time, maybe we'll get a glimpse into the deepest and most profound nature of Sangha of all. Bhante's great vision of Sangha as being like, a kind of quality, like the 11-headed and 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara, Mahakarunika, the greatly compassionate one. This consciousness of compassion which is expressed with these 11 heads and these 2 arms at the heart holding the bodhicitta, and these arms going out with an eye in each hand, reaching out to connect with all kinds of people. This quality of consciousness which is individual, particular, and yet is in complete harmony with everything else, with everybody else in the Sangha, in the spiritual community, and reaching out from the heart of the bodhicitta to connect with all of life, with all beings, wherever they may be. That's the ultimate expression of going for refuge to the Sangha. Leaving behind our individualism, leaving behind our self-centeredness, leaving behind our immersion in a group, and arriving into this quality of consciousness where particularity, individuality, and harmony and unity are not two, transcending all of those dichotomies for the benefit of all beings, for the benefit of all life. And then, perhaps if we have a little glimpse of that, we'll hear not just ourselves, but the whole of the universe chanting, Buddhang saranang gacchami, Dhammang saranang gacchami, Sanghang saranang gacchami.